Talking about HDR in Lightroom today. So I have these three images here with varying degrees of exposure. So we can see that this is the normal exposure. The highlights are pretty blown out. There's a lot of light around, so there's detail in the shadows. Here's a darker exposure where the highlights have a lot more detail in them. And then here's a much brighter exposure where there's a lot of detail in the shadows, a lot of information and all that foliage in there. So we're going to blend these images together. HDR is a high dynamic range where we're going to take, well, in this case, I think I'm going to take the darker exposure and the brighter exposure and blend the two together. We'll try that first, and then we'll do one where we blend all three. The reason we'd want to use the third is that it has a lot of these mid-tone details in it, sort of along the bricks. The brighter one, the bricks are getting a little washed out from the brightness of the lights. And in the darker one, the bricks are non-existent because of the darkness of the image. But let's try both of them and we'll see what happens. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select these two. And I've just held down Command and selected on the two. And then I'm going to right-click on it. And I'm going to say Photo Merge HDR. And that's going to bring up my HDR dialog. And you can see that I have the image cropped, but it's going to show me the entire image. My goal of this image is to make it a square image eventually. So here is the first one, and you can see that there's not a lot of settings in this, and that's because there's not a lot of settings. We can do a lot of the work we need to do on this image in the develop modules. So we have auto align, which is going to automatically align the images if they are a little bit out of alignment. I shot this on a tripod, so they should be in alignment. It's not level, but they should be in alignment. And then we have auto settings. You can see if I turn off auto settings, it goes a little bit darker. It doesn't matter if you leave auto settings on or off. We can adjust those settings in the develop module no matter what. So I usually just leave them on just to kind of see what Lightroom thinks it should do with all of that. There's also deghosting. Deghosting is if things have moved in your image. In the crop that I'm going to do on this, the thing that's probably most likely to move is the flag. And so if I go to high deghosting, it's going to redraw or rebuild the preview. And it may change the look of the flag a little bit as it tries to eliminate sort of the multiples of it if it moved in between the exposures. And you can see that I have show deghosting overlay. And so all of the red is the areas that it sees movement in, and it has changed that. So it's up to you if you have things that are moving in your image and you want to do the deghost overlay, you can totally do that. And then the last selection down here is to create a stack. And what that would do is take these images and stack them up with the HDR so that they all sort of stay together as one. I generally don't do that. So once I'm done with all of my settings, I hit merge and I get a dialog up here that is going to merge those images together. And it's going to give me a fourth image down here, a DNG, and it's going to have, after the file name, it's going to say HDR. And so we'll see that in just a second. And then that DNG will be the product of the merging of these two images. There it is. It uncropped my image and it uncorrected my image, which is fine. We can redo that stuff in the develop module. But you can see that it comes in with the auto settings, all of these develop settings over here that Lightroom decided needed to be done. I can see some banding in here. You see these red bands. I'm going to zoom in so you can kind of see it. That is most likely from the deghosting. And so I would probably reject this photo and redo it. But I'm going to save this just for now so that we can compare it to what we get when I take all three of these photos and do a photo merge HDR. So now I'm using that middle exposure. I have a dark exposure, a middle exposure, and a bright exposure. We're going to see how those all kind of come together in this shot. And on this one, I'm going to turn off my deghosting so that we don't get any other kind of weird artifacts that come up in our image. It's taking a little bit longer because it's utilizing 3 images to create this HDR. The more images you use, the longer this can take. You can bracket a lot of images and use them for an HDR, but the truth of the matter is you really don't need that many. 2 might do just fine. This third one might give us just that little touch more detail. I'm going to say none on my deghosting so that we can see if we can eliminate that moire pattern or that banding that showed up. And then I'm going to go ahead and say merge, and it's going to merge those together, and it's going to create me another HDR image. So we're going to have 2 HDR images, and then I'm going to also develop out the normal exposure, and we can compare how those look. So it looks like there's one of my images, and there's the other image. So this one is the new one that we just did. And you can see it's a little bit darker overall there. It just sort of caught up with the preview. But there seems to be more detail going on in the bricks, maybe just a touch. Yeah. And so it's auto-adjusted. I am going to recrop this, but before I do that, I'm going to transform it. And so you can see that my tripod wasn't quite level. I was moving in a little bit of a hurry because it was late and they were moving me along as they were closing Disneyland. And so I'm going to go ahead and transform this and say auto, and it's going to automatically rotate it and straighten all the lines on it. I'm also going to come up and add chromatic aberration removal and profile correction for the lens, so that'll just sort of tighten all that up. And then I can come back up here, and I think it's a little bit too yellow, so I'm going to bring the color temperature down just a little bit, probably somewhere in there, giving it more of a sort of a neutral, natural look. And now, because of the HDR, I sort of have like too much detail all over. But what's nice is I can see the individual lights on the building, which is good. I like having that level of detail. And the highlights are down quite a bit. I can bring them down just a little bit more. I think I'm going to close up the shadows just a bit. And then that may let me bring my exposure up just a touch. So I'm just going to kind of balance this out until I get the look that I like. I'm going to change my blacks, and I'm holding down options so that I can see where the clipping on the blacks are. And most of that is in the trees, and I don't mind that because I want those to go a little bit darker. And now we're starting it a little bit inside in here, which is pretty dark, but that works out pretty good. There's a little bit of maybe a touch of a haze to this, and so I'm just going to dehaze it a little bit. And I think that the vibrance is up just a bit too high. And honestly, on this one, I would probably come down here to the color and choose my greens, which is the trees. And I think I would bring that saturation down just a little bit. Those trees, you can see if I go all the way down, it makes them very less green. Those trees are super green. And I'm not really a fan of that like neon glowy green. Part of it is the different types of light that are shining on them that's causing a little bit of that. I could change the hue and make them a little bit more yellow and a little bit less blue in the greens. And I think that gives it a little more of a natural feel to it. So these are just some of the little adjustments that I'm going to do. And then I'm going to crop it because I don't want that person in the side. But I always sort of envisioned this as a square anyways. And so when I put this into the square image and hit return, I like this a lot. And so I think that that's a pretty decent shot. There's a lot of detail everywhere. What I'm going to do now is we have some ghosting issues there. You can see that's the ghosting issue of where that banner was moving around. So I may go back and do like a medium ghost or a light ghost on that. I think the heavy ghost is what gave me that pattern before. Because you can see in this image, one, we have a lot of noise that's come up from, that's all in that ghosting area. Remember those red previews? You can see exactly where that ghosting area is happening, but we do have sort of singular banners that are happening here. Honestly, what I would probably do with that if I was really concerned is go into Photoshop and make that correction. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring up this normal exposure one, and I'm going to make a virtual copy of it. So I right-clicked, and I'm going to say Create Virtual Copy. And what that does is it makes a copy, right? It duplicates that image so that I can make other adjustments to it and leave the normal one as is. So I'm going to take this copy number 1, which is this image here, right? Yes. And I am going to make my adjustments that I made to my other image. I'm going to bring the color temperature down just a little bit, and I'm going to bring my highlights down to try to bring some detail into those lights, and maybe open the shadows up just a little bit. I'm going to bring the brightness of the whites down. I'm going to check my black point. I'll make it something fairly similar to what I had in the other one, which is just a little bit down in there. I think I need to bring my exposure up sort of overall to make that happen. I think I'm going to bring the black point back down a little bit. The greens aren't quite as nuclear, but I'm going to still come down here and I'm going to make them a little bit more yellow and maybe take a little bit of saturation out of them just to sort of bring them down just a touch. It's still just a little bit warm. And so I'm going to kind of bring that color temperature down a little bit. So there I have sort of my adjustment. And if I switch between this one, which is the HDR, and this one, which is my adjustment, there's some subtle little differences, right? And this is going to be up to you, whether you want to do HDRs to make this work, or whether you just want to shoot and do all the adjustments. So you can see that the lights, the string of lights around the building, this is the non-HDR version. They're still quite bright and glowy, right? There's a little bit of a haze to them. I don't think I took the haze out. Let's try that and see if that helps at all. It doesn't. There's still not a lot of detail in those lights. When I go to the HDR version, you can see that there's a lot more detail in those lights. They don't quite have that same bright glow. Let's do a comparison of these. Let's bring up this one and we will drop our normal in there for reference so that we can kind of look at these side by side. So you can see that there's a lot more detail in the tree, a lot more texture that's going on in the tree. In the HDR version, we have that detail in the lights that's going on here. There's a little bit more detail maybe inside of the building as well. But a lot of it looks pretty similar. But I think that I like the HDR. I think the HDR gives me better color in the sky. I can just see that I haven't manipulated the image quite so hard. Like I've moved it softly around instead of big, bold strokes to try to get it to do what I want it to do. So in this case, I think the HDR would work just fine. It's up to you guys. I just wanted to kind of describe the process. You can also see, let's take a look. I'm going to come back out and let's take a look at the histograms of it. You can see that the histogram here has a little bit of a peak in the middle and it's pretty flat otherwise. And the histogram on the HDR has more of a peak, more information that's going on in those areas, and kind of a softer curve on it. So I think in this one, the HDR does slightly outdo the normal exposure. But that's HDR. You combine them together and then it gives you more latitude to work in the develop module.